The silence of the underground parking garage was a heavy, all-slicked veil, broken only by the rhythmic clack of Dante Moretti's bespoke Italian loafers against the concrete. He was the city's apex predator, a man whose presence usually cleared a room. Yet here, in the dim glow of flickering industrial lights, the air felt unnaturally still. He reached the door of his matte black sedan, the crown jewel of his fleet, and raised his foot to step toward the driver's side. Before his soul could touch the pavement, a hand, slender, trembling, and stained a deep, midnight black with engine grease, shot out from beneath the chassis. The fingers clamped around his ankle with the force of a desperate vice. Dante froze. His hand moved instinctively toward the holster tucked beneath his suit jacket, his brow furrowing in a lethal mix of confusion and mounting rage. No one touched Dante Moretti. No one dared to bridge the physical gap between the elite and the dirt. He looked down, expecting to see a beggar or a dying rival, but what he found was a shock that stalled his heart. A woman was sprawled on the cold, grimy floor, half hidden by the shadow of the car's undercarriage. Her face was a mosaic of soot and sweat, her hair matted against her forehead, but her eyes, large, amber, and burning with a terrifying urgency, locked onto his. "Don't move," she rasped, her voice a jagged blade of sound in the hollow garage. "If you put your weight on that seat, you're a memory, Morty." Dante's eyes narrowed, his gaze dropping to where her all-slicked fingers smeared the pristine leather of his trousers. The contrast was visceral, the soot-smudged nobody in tattered, charcoal-colored coveralls anchoring the man worth billions to the grease-stained earth. It was a power inversion so sudden it felt like a physical blow. "Who the hell are you?" Dante's voice was a low, dangerous rumble, but he didn't pull away. Something in the sheer terror of her expression, the way her wide eyes darted toward the fuel tank, held him motionless. "I'm the person making sure your brains don't end up on the ceiling," she snapped, her breath coming in ragged, shallow bursts. She didn't let go of his ankle. If anything, she gripped him tighter, her knuckles white beneath the grime. "There's a mercury switch detonator wired into the pressure sensor of the driver's seat. You sit, you die. I sit, I die. We're both currently standing on the edge of a very loud grave." Dante looked past her, squinting at the dark recesses of the car's belly. There, tucked behind the rear axle, a tiny, rhythmic red light pulsed like a heartbeat, slow, steady, and utterly indifferent to the life it was about to extinguish. The digital flare cast a hellish crimson glow over her dirty face, highlighting the raw defiance in her features. "A ghost bomb," Dante whispered, the realization finally piercing his cold exterior. His security team had swept this car an hour ago. To have a device, this sophisticated, planted so quickly meant the threat wasn't outside the garage. It was inside his inner circle. "I was finishing the exhaust work when they rolled it in," she said, her voice dropping to a low, electric hum as she finally released his leg and slid out from under the car, her movements fluid and feline despite the circumstances. She stood up, revealing a frame that was lean and hardened by labor, her tattered, Reed's Auto jumpsuit hanging off one shoulder to reveal a hint of a tactical undershirt beneath. She stood barely 5'6", but as she looked up at the most feared man in the territory, she didn't flinch. She wiped a streak of grease across her cheek, only smearing it further, and pointed a steady finger at the car. "My name is Rhea," she said, her gaze steady and unimpressed by his designer suit or the lethal aura he projected. "And right now, I'm the only friend you've got left in this city." Dante didn't answer immediately. He watched the way the neon signs from the street above filtered through the garage vents, puncturing the dark with vibrant blues and pinks that danced across her soot-stained skin. The predator in him was on high alert, his mind already calculating the betrayal of his men, but his eyes remained fixed on her. She was a disruptor, a grit-covered anomaly in his polished world. The sound of a distant engine revving echoed through the garage entrance. Rhea's head snapped toward the noise, her nostrils flaring. "They're coming back to check the fireworks," she whispered, reaching into a deep pocket of her coveralls and pulling out a ruggedized tablet, its screen glowing with complex wiring diagrams. "We can argue about my pay grade later, Morty. Right now, you need to move." For the first time in a decade, Dante Moretti didn't give the orders. He looked at the woman with the grease-stained hands and the amber eyes, and he followed. The shadows of the garage were suddenly incinerated. A roar of white-hot pressure slammed into the concrete, a shockwave that felt like a physical fist to the chest. Dante reacted with the honed instincts of a man who lived in the crosshairs, throwing his weight over Rhea and pinning her against a reinforced concrete pillar as the black sedan vanished into a pillar of roiling orange flame. Glass rained down like diamonds in the dark, tinkling against the floor in a dissonant melody. The heat was a living thing, a predatory wave that licked at the back of Dante's neck and singed the air in his lungs. For a moment, the world was nothing but the crackle of burning leather and the acrid stench of gasoline. Dante pressed his forehead against the cool stone of the pillar, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He waited for the scream, the high-pitched, panicked wail he had heard from a dozen women in his life when the violence of his world finally touched them. It never came. Instead, he felt a rhythmic, steady tapping against his chest. He pulled back, his eyes narrowing through the haze of black smoke, and found Rhea looking not at the inferno, but at the glowing screen of the tablet she had wedged between their bodies. Her face was illuminated by the flickering firelight, the orange glow dancing in the amber of her eyes. She wasn't trembling. Her breathing was fast, yes, but it was controlled, synchronized with the rapid movement of her thumbs across the glass. "Signals moving," she muttered, her voice impossibly level. "Standard RF burst, but the handshake is encrypted. They're using a rolling code, probably a high-gain transmitter within a 300-meter radius." Dante stared at her, his hand still hovering near the holster at his hip. The car, a $300,000 machine, was a mangled skeleton of melting metal 10 feet away, and this woman was dissecting the electronic ghost of its killer. "You're not screaming," Dante remarked, his voice a low, raspy velvet. Rhea didn't look up. "Screaming doesn't fix a broken circuit, Morty. And it definitely doesn't stop the person holding the remote." She tapped a final command, and a jagged green line spiked across a digital map of the city. "There, north exit, black SUV, tinted windows. They're waiting for the smoke to clear so they can confirm the kill." Dante looked toward the ramp, his jaw tightening. His security detail should have been there by now. The silence of his comms earbud was a deafening confirmation. He was alone, except for the mechanic. "Who are you, Rhea?" he asked, his shadow lengthening against the pillar as the fire roared behind them. No one working at Reed's Auto knows how to trace a military-grade encrypted handshake. She finally looked at him, a faint, sharp-edged smirk cutting through the soot on her face. "I told you, I'm the person making sure you stay alive. If you want to resume, wait until we're not standing in a giant target." She tucked the tablet into a specialized holster on her hip and grabbed a heavy, blackened wrench from the floor, her only weapon. The light from the burning car caught the grease on her skin, making her look less like a victim and more like a part of the machinery she lived for. She moved with a calculated, predatory grace, staying low to the ground and utilizing the shadows that the fire couldn't reach. Dante felt a strange, jarring spike of curiosity. He dealt in power, in men who bought loyalty and women who bought status, but Rhea was an enigma wrapped in gasoline and silicon. She didn't fear him, and she didn't seem to care about the car. She cared about the signal. "They're moving," she whispered, gesturing toward the shadows of a service corridor. "If they don't see a body in 60 seconds, they're coming down here to finish it with Lade. You have a backup plan, boss, or are we taking the motorcycle?" Dante looked at the flickering exit signs and then back at the woman who had just rewritten the rules of his night. "The motorcycle," he said, his voice dropping an octave as he stepped into the dark beside her. "Lead the way, mechanic." As they slipped into the damp, lightless depths of the service tunnel, the car exploded a second time, a final, dying gasp of fire. Rhea didn't even flinch. She just kept her eyes on the green dot on her screen, leading the king of the city into the rain-slicked unknown. The service tunnel opened into a narrow, rain-slicked alleyway where the smell of damp concrete and stagnant air fought the metallic tang of the explosion. Rhea didn't hesitate. She headed straight for a battered, custom-built cafe racer tucked beneath a rusted fire escape. It was a skeletal beast of matte steel and exposed wiring, looking more like a weapon than a vehicle. You're kidding, Dante said, his voice grating with a mix of disbelief and the remnants of smoke. You expect me to get on that? Rhea swung a leg over the saddle, the leather creaking under her weight. She kicked the engine over, and the bike roared to life with a guttural, unrefined scream that vibrated through the narrow walls. She looked back at him, her amber eyes flashing under the flicker of a dying neon sign. It's built for torque, not comfort. If you want a limousine, go back to the Fireball. Otherwise, get on. Dante glanced toward the garage entrance. The black SUV had just cleared the ramp, its headlights cutting through the rain like the eyes of a shark. He had no choice. He stepped onto the bike, his large frame dwarfing the machine. Hold on, she commanded. Dante hesitated. For 15 years, he had been the one in the driver's seat. He was the one who steered the city, the one who controlled the pace. To sit behind a woman half his size, to surrender the reins of his survival to her, felt like a physical violation of his code. But as Rhea pinned the throttle and the rear tire chewed into the wet pavement, the bike jerked forward with violent intent. Dante's hands found her waist. The fabric of her jumpsuit was rough and thin, and beneath it, he could feel the hard, coiled muscle of her core. She was solid, a pillar of focus in a world that had just turned into a blur of grey and neon. As they burst out of the alley and into the saturated glow of the main thoroughfare, the role reversal was absolute. Dante Moretti, the man who moved the world, was now nothing more than a passenger to a girl with grease under her fingernails. Rhea didn't drive like a civilian, she drove like someone who understood the physics of every bolt and bearing. She leaned the bike into a hard left, dragging a knee inches from the rain-soaked asphalt. Dante was forced to lean with her, his chest pressed against her back, his world narrowing down to the scent of her skin, a sharp, intoxicating blend of jasmine soap and high-octane fuel. Behind them, the SUV roared, weaving through the midnight traffic with reckless desperation. A gunshot cracked through the air, the bullet shattering the tailpipe of a parked car to their right. "Keep your head down," Rhea yelled over the wind. She didn't panic. Instead, she accelerated into the chaos. She chose paths no car could follow, squeezing through the narrow gaps between idling buses, hopping curbs into pedestrian plazas, and diving into the labyrinthine markets of the lower district. Dante found himself tightening his grip on her waist, his fingers digging into the fabric of her coveralls. He could feel the vibration of her heart through her back, steady and rhythmic, a counterpoint to the screeching tires and the sirens beginning to wail in the distance. The city was a kaleidoscope of blurred red taillights and shimmering blue puddles. Rhea banked the bike so sharply into a narrow corridor of food stalls that Dante's expensive suit jacket brushed against a hanging banner. She was playing a high-stakes game of chicken with the city itself, using her knowledge of the streets to weave a web that their pursuers couldn't untangle. Dante watched her profile as they blasted past a row of glowing Hangul signs. Her jaw was set, her eyes fixed on a horizon only she could see. In the dark, under the assault of the rain, she looked less like a mechanic and more like a Valkyrie of the concrete. He realized then that his power, his money, his soldiers, his name, meant nothing here. In the space between two wheels and a wet road, Rhea was the only god that mattered. With a final, daring surge of speed, she cut through a construction site, weaving between stacks of rebar before sliding the bike into the shadowed mouth of a freight elevator in an unmarked industrial building. The doors groaned shut just as the headlights of the SUV swept past the street outside. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling engine and their shared, heavy breathing. Rhea cut the lights, plunging them into a thick, electric darkness. Dante didn't let go of her waist immediately. He sat there in the dark, his hands still anchored to the woman who had just driven him out of his own grave. Feeling the strange, lingering heat of the flight. "We are clear," she whispered, her voice low and steady, "for now." Dante finally pulled his hands away, the absence of her warmth feeling strangely cold. He stepped off the bike, adjusting his ruined jacket, his eyes searching her face in the shadows. "Where are we?" "My territory," she said, kicking the stand down and standing up. She didn't look at him, she was already back on her tablet, checking the perimeter. "Welcome to the safe house, boss. Try not to bleed on the floor." The freight elevator groaned to a halt, the doors sliding open with a heavy, industrial sigh. Dante stepped out into a cavernous loft that smelled of ozone, soldering iron, and old secrets. This wasn't a penthouse, it was a sanctuary of high-end salvage. Walls were lined with flickering monitors, disassembled drone frames, and a workbench that looked more like an operating table for machines. Ria walked toward the center of the room, her movements stiff with the lingering adrenaline of the chase. She didn't look at him as she reached for the heavy zipper of her charcoal coveralls. With a sharp, metallic rasp, she pulled it down. Dante stood motionless in the shadows, his pulse slowing into a heavy, rhythmic thrum as she shrugged the grease-stained fabric off her shoulders. The jumpsuit pooled around her boots, leaving her in a slate-gray, high-neck tactical undershirt. The compression fabric clung to her like a second skin, mapping the lean, functional muscle of her back and the sharp curve of her waist. Her skin was a map of contradictions, soot-smudged collarbones and pale, unblemished shoulders, glowing under the cool hum of overhead lead strips. She reached up, pulling her dark hair out of its matted tie, and for a fleeting second, the princess of Greece vanished, replaced by someone far more dangerous. "Sit," she commanded, gesturing toward a swivel chair bolted to the floor. Dante didn't move. He watched her pick up his encrypted comms unit, the one that had gone dead the moment the garage turned into an oven. "My security team spent millions on that encryption, Ria. It's supposed to be unhackable." "Your security team bought a shelf-stable product from a vendor who probably sold the backdoors to your brother for half the price," she countered, her voice low and focused. She stepped into his personal space, the scent of her, that sharp jasmine and raw gasoline, hitting him like a physical blow. She reached for the device clipped to his ear, her fingers brushing against the sensitive skin of his jaw. The contact was electric. Dante's hand shot up, his fingers circling her wrist. He didn't squeeze, but the weight of his grip was a reminder of the power he usually wielded. Up close, the heat radiating from her was intense, a localized storm in the cold loft. Her amber eyes didn't flicker, she didn't pull away. She simply looked down at his hand, then back up at him, a faint, challenging tilt to her head. "You want it fixed, or do you want to play boss?" she whispered. Dante's thumb brushed against the pulse point in her wrist. It was racing, a frantic beat that betrayed the cool composure of her face. He let go, his hand dropping to the armrest. "Fix it." She worked with a terrifying, surgical efficiency. She cracked the casing of the high-tech unit with a precision pick, exposing the emerald glow of the motherboard. As she leaned over him to plug the device into her main console, her hip brushed against his knee. The proximity was stifling, the air in the loft suddenly too thin. Dante watched the way the muscles in her forearms corded as she typed, her fingers flying across a holographic keyboard with a speed that made his own elite IT department look like amateurs. "There," she muttered, a jagged line of code turning from red to a steady, mocking blue. "Your unhackable comms had a proximity-based kill switch hidden in the firmware. Whoever did this didn't just want you dead. They wanted you isolated. They wanted to hear you scream for help into a dead line." She turned toward him, her face inches from his. The cold blue light of the monitors reflected in her eyes, making them look like polished jewels. The silence between them was no longer about the assassins or the explosion. It was about the raw, magnetic pull of two people who had just stared into the sun and survived. Dante reached out, his hand hovering just above the soot-stained skin of her shoulder. He could feel the warmth of her, the vibration of her breathing. "You're a ghost, Ria. No one with your skills stays in a garage unless they're hiding from something worse than a car bomb." Ria didn't flinch. She leaned in closer, the heat of her body a silent provocation. Her gaze dropped to his mouth for a fraction of a second before snapping back to his eyes. "Maybe I just liked the smell of oil, Dante, or maybe I was waiting for someone worth the effort of saving." She didn't move away. Instead, she picked up a specialized scanner and began running it over his chest, checking for hidden trackers in his suit. The device hummed, a low, intimate vibration that echoed the tension in the room. Every time the scanner passed over his heart, the beat skipped, a betrayal of the cold-blooded king's composure. "You're clean," she said softly, her voice a raspy silk that seemed to vibrate against his skin. She set the scanner down, but her hands stayed on his shoulders, her thumbs tracing the edge of his ruined suit jacket. The tech is fixed. Your empire is waiting for a sign of life, but for tonight, you're in my world now. Dante looked at her, the mechanic who had stripped away his status and left him with nothing but the raw adrenaline of being alive. He realized, with a jolt of genuine shock, that he didn't want to leave. He wanted to see how much further this fire would burn. The blue glow of the monitors cast long, skeletal shadows across the loft as Dante stood up, his height reclaiming the space. He reached into the inner pocket of his ruined jacket and pulled out a heavy, platinum-plated clip. He peeled off a stack of high-denomination notes, an amount that would have bought the garage she worked in 10 times over, and set them on the edge of her grease-stained workbench. "For the bike, the tech, and the silence," Dante said, his voice returning to the smooth, transactional chill that had built his empire. "Consider it a down payment. When this is over, you'll never have to touch a wrench again. I'll set you up in a villa in Jeju. New name, new life." Rhea looked at the money, then at him. The silence stretched, taut and vibrating like a wire under too much tension. For a moment, the only sound was the hum of the cooling servers. Then she laughed. It wasn't a sound of joy. It was a sharp, jagged bark of derision that cut through Dante's composure like a blade. She picked up the stack of bills. With a flick of her wrist, she sent the money flying. The notes fluttered through the air like wounded birds, landing in the oil pans and among the scrap metal on the floor. "You think this is a transaction?" she asked, stepping toward him until her chest was nearly touching his. "You think you can just buy the fact that I saw you at your weakest, that I held your life in my hands while you were shaking on the back of my bike?" Dante's jaw tightened, his eyes darkening. "It's how the world works, Rhea. Everything has a price. Loyalty, safety, silence. I'm paying you for your service." "I didn't save you because of your bank account, Dante. I saved you because I'm a mechanic. I see something broken, I fix it," she snapped, her amber eyes blazing with a fierce, sudden heat. She grabbed his hand, the one that had just offered the bribe, and held it up between them. She forced him to look at the contrast. Her hand was stained with black carbon and industrial lubricant, the marks of a life spent building and maintaining. His hand, though manicured and clean of physical dirt, was marked by the jagged lines of his tattoos and the invisible weight of 1,000 ruthless orders. "Look at us," she whispered, her voice trembling with a raw moral fury. "My hands are dirty from oil, Morty. I deal in machines that follow the laws of physics. If I mess up, the engine stalls. But your hands, yours are dirty from blood. You deal in people you can break, buy, or bury. There's a difference." The words hit Dante with more force than the explosion in the garage. He had been called a monster, a tyrant, and a king, but no one had ever looked at the fundamental nature of his soul and found it lacking compared to a common laborer. She wasn't just rejecting his money, she was rejecting his entire worldview. "I do what is necessary to survive," Dante growled, his grip on her wrist tightening instinctively. "The same as you." "No," Rhea countered, her face inches from his. "I survive by being useful, you survive by being feared. You think that villa in Jeju is a gift. It's a cage. You want to hide me away because as long as I'm around, you have to remember that a girl who smells like gasoline is the only reason you're still breathing. You can't stand that you owe me something you can't put a price tag on." She wrenched her hand away from his, her breathing heavy. The high-heat intimacy of the previous hour had soured into something bitter and profound. Dante felt a strange, hollow ache in his chest, a sensation he hadn't felt since he was a boy with nothing to his name. He realized she was right. He wanted to buy her because he didn't know how to relate to someone he couldn't control. "You're a fool," Dante said, though the words lacked their usual lethality. "In this city, money is the only thing that keeps the monsters away." "The monsters are already here, Dante," Rhea said, turning back to her monitors, her silhouette sharp and defiant against the blue light. "One of them is standing in my loft trying to pay me to forget he's human. Keep your money. I'd rather have the grease." She didn't look at him again, but the moral weight of her words hung in the air, heavier than the machines surrounding them. Dante looked at the bills scattered in the dirt, and for the first time in his life, he felt poor. The heavy silence of the loft was shattered by the distant, rhythmic thud of a high-caliber rifle. The glass pane near the ceiling disintegrated, raining shards down like frozen tears. Dante didn't even have time to curse before he was slammed sideways, the momentum of a stray round catching him high in the shoulder. He grunted, a sound of pure, concentrated pain as he hit the floor beside the workbench. Rhea was across the room in a heartbeat, staying low beneath the line of fire. Morty. She skidded to a halt beside him, her hands instantly flying to his suit jacket. The dark fabric was already saturated, a deep, blooming crimson that looked black under the blue LED lights. Dante's face was a mask of grey marble, his teeth gritted so hard his jaw muscles stood out in sharp relief. "I'm fine," he hissed, though his breath was shallow and jagged. "Shut up," Rhea snapped, her voice stripped of everything but clinical urgency. She grabbed a pair of industrial shears from her bench and with a single, practiced motion, shredded the shoulder of his bespoke jacket and the fine silk shirt beneath. The wound was ugly, a jagged entry point where the lead had tumbled through muscle. The bleeding was rhythmic, a pulse of life escaping into the grime of the floor. Rhea didn't have a medical kit. She didn't have morphine. What she had was a technician's precision and a collection of tools designed for the delicate internal workings of high-performance engines. "Look at me," she commanded, her fingers, stained with oil and now his blood, cupping his jaw to force his gaze to hers. "I have to get it out. If I don't, you'll bleed out before the elevator hits the lobby. Do you trust me?" Dante looked into her amber eyes. There was no pity there, only a fierce, burning focus. He nodded once, a slow movement that cost him everything. Rhea moved with a terrifying speed. She grabbed a pair of long-nosed surgical pliers, custom-modified for microwiring, and a small butane torch used for soldering. She clicked the torch, the blue flame hissing in the dark as she sterilized the metal. The scent of ozone and singed steel filled the air, mixing with the metallic tang of blood. "Hold him down," she whispered to the empty room, as if summoning the ghosts of the machines to help her. She pressed a clean rag into his good hand. "Bite on this. Don't make a sound." She didn't wait. She leaned over him, her body pinning his legs to the floor, her chest inches from his. The proximity was a suffocating heat, a localized storm of skin and sweat. As she probed the wound with the sterilized pliers, Dante's body bucked once, a silent scream vibrating through the floorboards. Rhea's hands were steady, impossibly steady. She worked the way she fixed a gearbox, feeling for the obstruction with the sensitivity of a master craftsman. Her forehead was beaded with sweat, a drop falling onto his collarbone, sizzling against his feverish skin. "Got it," she breathed, her voice a low, melodic hum meant to anchor him. With a sharp, wet sound, she extracted the flattened lead slug and dropped it onto the concrete. It clattered with a final, hollow ring. Dante's eyes rolled back, his breathing turning into a series of broken stutters. "Stay with me, Morty," she whispered, her voice dropping into a raspy, intimate register. She grabbed a specialized cauterizing iron, a tool meant for sealing synthetic fuel lines. "This is going to be the worst part. Look at me, don't look away." As the heated metal touched his skin, the smell of burning flesh filled the loft. Dante's fingers dug into her forearms, his nails drawing blood through her tactical shirt, but he didn't look away. He watched the way her hair fell over her face, the way her lips were parted in concentration, the way she seemed to be breathing for both of them. The pain was a whiteout, a total erasure of the world, leaving only the sensation of Rhea's hands on him. In that moment, the high heat between them wasn't about desire, it was about the raw, visceral bond of survival. She was stitching his soul back into his body with the same calloused hands that fixed broken engines. When she finally pulled back, her chest was heaving, her shirt soaked with his blood and her own sweat. She applied a pressure bandage made of clean rags and industrial tape, her movements slowing as the immediate danger passed. She stayed there, draped over him in the dark, the heat of their bodies merging into a single, frantic pulse. Dante reached up, his hand trembling as he brushed a stray lock of hair from her soot-smudged forehead. His voice was a ghost of itself. You really are a mechanic, aren't you?" Rhea looked down at him, her gaze softening for the first time that night. She didn't move away. She let her weight rest against him, a silent admission of the toll the night had taken. "I told you, Morty, I fix things, even monsters." The shadows of the loft deepened as the storm outside finally broke, rain lashing against the high, reinforced windows with a rhythmic fury. Dante lay against the base of the workbench, his head lolling back against the cold metal, while Rhea remained knelt between his boots. The adrenaline that had sustained them through the frantic surgery had curdled into a heavy, aching exhaustion. The only light left came from the low-power mode of the monitors, casting a ghostly, flickering indigo across their faces. "You should have let me go," Dante rasped, his voice sounding like gravel being crushed. He watched the steady rise and fall of Rhea's shoulders. "A man like me, we don't die in bed, Rhea. We die in garages. We die in alleys. Saving me just delays the inevitable." Rhea wiped a smudge of his blood from her cheek, her fingers leaving a dark streak across her skin. She didn't look away. "Is that what you want? To be another cautionary tale for the next man who wants your chair?" Dante closed his eyes, a bitter, hollow laugh rattling in his chest. "I'm tired, Rhea. I've spent 15 years looking at every person I meet as a potential bullet. I've built a kingdom out of glass, and tonight I watched it shatter. The boss," he spat the word as if it were poison. "The boss is just a title for the man who hasn't been betrayed yet. I'm tired of the noise. I'm tired of the blood. I'm tired of being a ghost in a bespoke suit." The confession hung in the air, raw and bleeding, more vulnerable than the wound in his shoulder. Dante Moretti, the apex predator of the underworld, had finally admitted the weight of his crown was crushing him. Rhea leaned forward, her hands resting flat on his chest, feeling the heavy thud of his heart beneath her palms. "You think you're the only one living in a cage?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "I'm a ghost too, Dante. I've spent my life in the grease and the dark because it's the only place people don't look. I'm a genius with a wrench and a circuit board, but to the world, I'm just part of the machinery. I'm invisible. I've been so quiet for so long that I forgot what my own voice sounded like, until I had to scream at you to save your life." She looked up at him, her amber eyes shimmering with unshed tears and a sudden, fierce longing. "I'm tired of being the girl in the shadows, waiting for the world to notice I'm human. I'm tired of fixing things for people who don't even know my name." In the suffocating intimacy of the dark, the distance between the Mafia King and the mechanic vanished. It was a collision of two broken spirits who had finally found the only person capable of seeing them clearly. Dante reached up, his hand trembling as he cupped the back of her neck, pulling her toward him. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was a desperate, high-stakes collision, a heat that was both physical and spiritual. It tasted of salt, iron, and the electric charge of a storm. Dante pulled her into the space between his legs, his good arm wrapping around her waist with a possessive, grounding force. Rhea moved against him with a frantic hunger, her hands tangling in his hair, her body seeking the heat of the man she had just pulled back from the brink of death. It was more than desire, it was a mutual recognition. In the sanctuary of the all-scented loft, they weren't a boss and a mechanic. They were two survivors clinging to each other in the wreckage of their lives. Dante buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing in the scent of her, the jasmine, the gasoline, the life. For the first time in his memory, the internal noise of his empire fell silent. "I see you, Rhea," he murmured against her skin, his voice a vow. "I see all of you." Rhea pulled back just enough to look him in the eye, her fingers tracing the jagged line of his jaw. "Then don't go back, Dante. Don't go back to being a ghost." The air in the room felt heavy, charged with the realization that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. They were no longer bound by a transaction or a car bomb. They were bound by the shared weight of their secrets. In the dark, amidst the cold metal and flickering screens, they had found a fire that didn't burn to destroy, but to keep the world at bay. The peace of their shared breathing lasted only as long as the storm's eye. It was shattered not by a sound, but by a sudden, jarring shift in the loft's atmosphere, the subtle drop in air pressure as the heavy freight elevator began its slow, grinding ascent from the ground floor. Rhea snapped back from Dante's embrace, her eyes instantly shifting from the warmth of the moment to the cold, analytical focus of a hunter. She didn't say a word. She lunged for her tablet, her fingers dancing across the screen to pull up the elevator's internal camera feed. "He's here," she whispered, the blue light of the screen casting sharp, jagged shadows across her face. Dante struggled to sit upright, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun he'd set on the workbench. His face was pale, the exertion of the previous hour having drained his reserves, but his eyes were lethal. "How many?" "Just one," Rhea said, her brow furrowing as the image resolved. "He's confident. He thinks he's coming to collect a corpse." On the screen, a man in a charcoal suit stood casually in the center of the elevator. It was Marco, Dante's underboss, his brother in everything but blood. He was checking his reflection in the polished brass of the elevator doors, adjusting a silk tie that Dante had gifted him for his 10-year anniversary with the family. He held a silenced pistol with the bored nonchalance of a man heading into a routine meeting. "Marco," Dante rasped, the name tasting like ash. "He's the one who authorized the sweep. He's the one who told me the car was safe. He expects to find you slumped against that pillar, bleeding out while I cower in a corner," Rhea said. She looked at Dante, then at his trembling hand, the one that couldn't even keep the pistol level. She reached out and gently pushed his hand down. "He's wrong about both." The elevator hummed, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the scrap metal on the floor. Dante looked at Rhea, seeing the way she stood, balanced on the balls of her feet, a heavy, custom-weighted torque wrench in one hand and a high-voltage stun prod she'd stripped from a security drone in the other. "Rhea, don't," Dante warned, his voice thick with a sudden, agonizing fear for her. "He's a professional. He'll kill you without blinking." Rhea leaned down, her lips brushing Dante's forehead one last time. "This is my shop, Dante. In here, I'm the professional. Stay in the shadows. Let him see what he expects to see." The elevator bell chimed, a cheerful, out-of-place sound in the suffocating tension. The doors slid open with a heavy rattle. Marco stepped out into the dark loft, his footsteps echoing with an arrogant rhythm. He didn't rush. He clicked on a high-powered tactical light, the beam cutting through the gloom like a scalpel. "Dante, you still with us, brother? I'd hate for you to miss the eulogy I've prepared. It's quite moving." The light swept across the room, illuminating the blood-stained rags on the floor and finally settling on Dante, who sat slumped in the shadows of the workbench, his head down, his breathing labored and wet. "There you are," Marco said, his voice dripping with a faux sympathetic silkiness. He stepped closer, the silhouette of his suppressed pistol lengthening against the wall. "I have to admit, I'm impressed you made it this far. The girl was a nice touch. Where is she? I hope she didn't run. I hate loose ends, especially pretty ones." Marco stopped 5 feet from Dante, his shadow looming over the fallen king. He raised the pistol, aiming it squarely at the center of Dante's forehead. "Any last words, or shall we just let the silence speak for itself?" Dante slowly lifted his head. He didn't look at the gun. He looked past Marco, a ghost of a smirk touching his bloodless lips. "I think the lady has something to say." Marco's eyes widened, but before he could even begin to pivot, the darkness behind him erupted. Rhea didn't come at him with a gun. She came at him with the cold, calculated efficiency of a machine. She dropped from the overhead rafters, her boots slamming into Marco's kidneys with a sickening thud. As he staggered, the air leaving his lungs in a wheeze, she drove the stun prod into the base of his neck. Blue sparks illuminated the loft in a series of violent, staccato flashes. Marco's body arched, his muscles seizing as 50,000 volts bypassed his nervous system. The pistol clattered to the floor, sliding away into the grease. Rhea didn't stop. She swung the torque wrench with a practiced, industrial arc, the heavy steel connecting with Marco's temple. He hit the concrete like a sack of lead, his head bouncing once before he went still. Rhea stood over him, her chest heaving, the blue light of the prod reflecting in her wild, amber eyes. She looked down at the man who had tried to kill her world, then turned to Dante. She wasn't a witness. She wasn't a victim. She was the one holding the power. "I told you," she panted, her voice a jagged rasp in the silence. "He was wrong." The rhythmic thud of Marco's body hitting the floor was merely the opening note of a much darker symphony. From the service stairwell, The muffled sound of synchronized footsteps signaled that the traitor hadn't come alone. Marco was the face of the betrayal, but the cleaners had arrived to finish the harvest. Dante tried to surge upward, his hand clawing for the workbench, but his shoulder flared in a white-hot agony that anchored him to the shadows. "Ria, get out," he groaned, his voice cracking. "There are more, at least 4. Ria didn't move toward the exit. Instead, she stepped over Marco's unconscious form and reached for a heavy, industrial breaker switch mounted on the central pillar. "I told you, Dante," she said, her voice dropping into a cold, rhythmic cadence. "This isn't a penthouse, it's a workshop, and in a workshop, everything is a tool if you know how to use it." She slammed the switch down. The loft didn't go dark, it came alive. The high-pitched whine of industrial servos filled the air as the heavy freight elevator, the only easy exit, was magnetically locked into place. From the ceiling, a series of heavy-duty winch cables, usually used for pulling engines, began to whip through the air like steel snakes. The first 2 assassins burst through the stairwell door, their tactical suppressed rifles sweeping the room. They were professionals, moving in a low-light stagger, but they were trained to fight men, not an environment. Ria tapped a command into the tablet mounted on her wrist. To the left of the doorway, a high-pressure pneumatic line, disguised as a support pipe, hissed open. A cloud of atomized industrial degreaser sprayed into the air, turning the floor into a frictionless sheet of ice. The lead assassin's boots lost purchase instantly, his momentum carrying him forward into a helpless skid. Before his partner could compensate, Ria yanked a secondary lever. A heavy, overhead gantry crane, carrying a half-ton block of rusted iron, swung across the room with silent, predatory speed. It didn't hit the men, it struck the heavy steel tool cabinets they were using for cover. The cabinets crumpled like soda cans, pinning the second shooter against the brick wall in a chorus of grinding metal and muffled shouts. Dante watched from the shadows, his breath hitching in his throat. He had spent his life surrounded by men who used gunpowder and bravado to settle scores. He had never seen someone use the laws of physics as a weapon. Ria moved through the chaos with a terrifying, balletic precision, her silhouette a blur of grease and determination against the sparking machinery. "Sector 2, Ria whispered to herself, her eyes fixed on the heat signatures blooming on her screen. The final 2 shooters emerged from the back service lift, flanking the rows of server racks. They fired toward the center of the room, the bullets thudding into heavy iron engine blocks. Ria didn't fire back. She didn't even have a gun. She waited until they stepped between a pair of high-voltage testing coils she used for armored battery calibration. She didn't look at them as she completed the circuit. A localized electromagnetic pulse rippled through the air, blue arcs of electricity dancing between the coils. The assassins' tactical headsets shrieked with feedback, and their electronic sights went dark. In the momentary blindness of the EMP, Ria triggered the overhead fire suppression system. But it wasn't water that rained down. It was a heavy, suffocating cloud of fire-retardant foam, thick and blinding, that turned the floor into a sightless white abyss. The shooters stumbled, coughing and disoriented. Ria emerged from the mist like a wraith, the heavy torque wrench in her hand. She didn't hesitate. 2 swift, industrial strikes, one to the knee, one to the temple, and the remaining threats were neutralized. The loft fell into a sudden, vibrating silence, save for the hiss of the dying steam pipes. Ria stood in the center of the wreckage, her chest heaving, her tactical shirt soaked with sweat and the residue of the foam. She looked at the 4 elite killers, men who would have ended Dante Moretti's reign in a heartbeat, now broken and tangled in the guts of her workshop. She turned toward Dante, the blue light of the dying sparks reflecting in her amber eyes. She wasn't the girl he had tried to buy, and she wasn't the witness he had tried to protect. She was the hero of a story he hadn't even known was being written. Dante looked at his own blood-stained hands, then up at her. For the first time in his life, the king of the city felt small, but in that smallness, he felt a strange, soaring sense of freedom. He didn't need his soldiers. He didn't need his empire. He just needed the woman who could fix the world with a wrench and a steady heart. "You're amazing," Dante whispered, the words carrying a weight of genuine or that no bribe could ever simulate. Ria wiped a smudge of oil from her forehead and offered him a tired, sharp-edged smile. "I'm a mechanic, Dante, I told you. I just had to clear the debris." The sirens of the city wailed in the distance, a morning choir for a kingdom that was already cold. Dante stood by the shattered window of the loft, watching the flashing red and blue lights reflect off the rain-slicked pavement far below. Behind him, the wreckage of his former life, his underboss, his assassins, and the charred remnants of his reputation lay scattered across the floor like scrap metal. "They're coming," Dante said, his voice devoid of the gravelly command that had once made men tremble. He turned to Ria, who was systematically wiping the hard drives of her servers. "If I walk out of here, I go back to the cage. The war will start tomorrow morning, and it won't stop until every street is painted red." Ria paused, her hand hovering over the final kill switch. She looked at him, seeing the man behind the shadow, the one who was tired of being a ghost. "Then don't walk out," she said softly. The plan was executed with the same mechanical precision as the night's survival. By the time the police breached the loft, the building was an inferno. A secondary explosion, triggered by the remaining fuel lines, collapsed the central floor. When the fire marshals finally sifted through the cooling ash days later, they found DNA fragments and a melted platinum watch that matched the profile of Dante Moretti. The headlines across the globe were identical: "The king is dead." 5 years later, the humidity of a remote coastal town in Southeast Asia hung heavy and sweet, smelling of salt spray and tropical jasmine. Far from the neon-choked alleys of the city, a high-end custom shop sat perched on the edge of a cliff, its wide bay doors open to the turquoise sea. It was a place where millionaires brought their vintage engines to be resurrected, though the owner never advertised. Inside, the air hummed with the familiar, comforting song of a lathe. Ria stood at the center of the shop, her hair pulled back in a practical knot, her skin tanned a deep bronze by the sun. She was leaning over the exposed heart of a 1960s Italian roadster, her movements fluid and authoritative. She didn't look like a girl hiding in the shadows anymore. She looked like a queen in her own right, her empire built of chrome and steel. "Wrench," she said, not looking up. A large, calloused hand reached into the frame, placing the 10 socket precisely into her palm. Dante stood beside her, his once bespoke suits replaced by a simple black t-shirt and rugged work trousers. The sharp, predatory edge of his features had been softened by the peace of the sea, though the lethal strength remained in his shoulders. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He watched her work with a quiet, unwavering devotion that made the power he'd once held seem like a hollow toy. He was no longer the man who gave orders. He was the man who anticipated her needs before she even voiced them. He moved through the shop as her silent shadow, cleaning the tools, prepping the chassis, and ensuring that the world stayed far away from the woman who had saved him. A wealthy client, a man who thought his money made him important, walked into the shop, his voice booming over the sound of the ocean. "I heard the owner was the best in the hemisphere. Which one of you is in charge?" Dante didn't even look at the man. He continued polishing a chrome bumper, his eyes fixed on the reflection of the woman at the workbench. Ria straightened up, wiping a smear of grease from her forehead with the back of her glove. She looked the client in the eye with a gaze that had once stared down a mafia empire and won. "I am," she said, her voice steady and absolute. The client blinked, his gaze drifting to the massive, silent man working in the background. "And him, your bodyguard." Ria glanced back at Dante. A small, private smile touched her lips, a secret shared in the heat of a single, forgotten night. "No," she said, her voice dropping into a raspy, intimate silk. "He's my assistant, and he's exactly where he wants to be." As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in the same vibrant neons they had once fled, Dante stepped closer to her. He reached out, his hand, now stained with honest oil and salt, briefly brushing against hers. There were no crowns here, no blood-stained ledgers, and no traitors in the dark. The mafia boss was dead. In his place was a man who had finally found a loyalty worth the silence. He didn't need the world to know his name, as long as she was the one who called him home.